There's a specific sentence someone said to me that I still think about years later, more often than I probably should. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled it. Nobody meant it as some kind of turning point when they said it. It was just a plain, quiet observation, the kind of thing said almost in passing by someone whose job is to notice things the person in front of them has stopped noticing about themselves, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that took months to fully reach the edges. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way. If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again." So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. Let me ask you to picture something with me for just a moment. You're standing in your kitchen in Chicago, Illinois, a city you've lived in for the better part of 6 decades, and it's a Tuesday in February, and the wind off the lake is doing what it always does in February, which is come at you sideways from a direction you were never quite prepared for. And you're standing there, holding a coffee cup that went cold 20 minutes ago because you got distracted, staring out the window at a street you could draw from memory with your eyes closed. And you're thinking, not dramatically, not in a way that would worry anyone if they could see you, just quietly and plainly, that you cannot imagine doing this again tomorrow. Not the cold coffee, not the sideways wind, not the 50 years of accumulated rightness about a city that somehow stopped feeling like yours, about 3 days after the woman who made it yours got on a plane back to the Philippines and didn't come back alone. That's not a crisis. That's just a Wednesday in February when you're 68 years old and your wife of 32 years is 8,000 miles away burying her mother, and you realize, standing in your own kitchen, that the city you've always loved feels like someone else's coat you've been wearing for so long you forgot it never quite fit right, without her inside it with you. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old. And 3 years ago, I sold my condo in Lincoln Park, packed what mattered into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases, and moved permanently to a small coastal city in the Philippines called Dumaguete, on the southeastern coast of Negros Island, where the sea comes right up to the edge of the boulevard in the evenings, and strangers nod at you like they know you before they actually do. I did it because my wife Maribel was from there, and because after 32 years of her making Chicago feel like home, it seemed right that I finally try to do the same for her. And because, honestly, staying in Chicago without her daily presence in it was starting to feel like a form of stubbornness I couldn't quite justify anymore, even to myself. If stories like this one matter to you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because there's more of this coming, a lot more, and I think you're going to want to be around for it. Maribel and I met in 1991 at a nursing conference in Chicago, which sounds clinical when I say it out loud, but the reality was she was standing in the hotel lobby the first morning of the conference, laughing at something a colleague had said, laughing the way some people laugh, completely, without checking whether anyone was watching, and I was passing through that lobby on the way to a session I was already late for, and I stopped walking. Not slowed down, stopped. A complete stranger's laugh had rooted me to the tile floor of the Marriott on Michigan Avenue, and I stood there like an idiot until she noticed me, standing there like an idiot, and instead of looking away, She just raised an eyebrow, still smiling, and said, "You look lost." I told her I'd been navigating Chicago my entire life and had somehow just gotten lost in a hotel lobby, which made her laugh again, and that was, more or less, the entire foundation of the next 32 years. Maribel had come to Chicago from Dumaguete 7 years before we met, trained as a nurse, worked at Northwestern Memorial, and had built herself a life in the city the way immigrants build lives when they're serious about it, thoroughly, from scratch, with none of the nostalgic looking over the shoulder that keeps some people from ever fully arriving. She had friends here, a church here, favorite restaurants here, a hairdresser she'd been going to for 5 years who knew exactly how she liked her hair done without being asked. She was, by the time I met her, as much a Chicagoan as anyone born here, maybe more so. The way people who chose a city always end up loving it more specifically than people who simply stayed. I grew up in Chicago, in a house on the north side that my father bought in 1959 and lived in until he died. I spent my working life as a general contractor, built a business over 30 years, doing mostly residential and small commercial renovation, the kind of work where you spend a lot of time reading old buildings, figuring out what they were originally, what they'd become, and what they wanted to be next. It's a good way to spend your working years. You make things better than you found them, and that stays true whether the economy is cooperating or not, whether the job is a kitchen in a 3-flat in Pilsen or a complete gut rehab on a Victorian in Evanston that someone's grandmother had let go for 15 years. Buildings are mostly honest about what they need. People are more complicated, which is probably why I was better with buildings than I was with people for most of my 30s. Maribel fixed that, in the patient, specific way she fixed most things that needed fixing. We married in 1993, 2 years after the hotel lobby, in a ceremony at a Catholic church in Pilsen that was her church and became, through her, mine as well, and we lived first in an apartment in Wicker Park, then bought the Lincoln Park condo in 1998, a 3rd-floor unit with tall windows and original hardwood floors, and a view of the neighborhood that changed with every season in a way that never quite got old, the way certain views in certain cities never quite get old, even after you've seen them thousands of times. We had one son, Marcus, who arrived in 1995 and immediately became the person Maribel organized the majority of her waking hours around, not to the exclusion of anything else, but with a total, uncomplicated priority that I have always admired and never quite managed to replicate myself. I loved Marcus with everything I had. Maribel loved Marcus with everything she had, and then found more she hadn't known was there. Marcus is 30 now, lives in Seattle now, works in software engineering, married a woman named Chloe from Portland 2 years ago, and calls on Sundays with a warmth and regularity that I suspect is entirely his mother's influence expressing itself through him, since he is, in almost every way that matters, recognizably her son. We visited the Philippines for the first time together in 1996, 3 years into our marriage, a trip to Dumaguete to see Maribel's family that I approached with the particular mixture of eagerness and secret anxiety of a man who understood that he was about to be evaluated by people whose evaluation actually mattered. Her parents were alive then, her father, a retired schoolteacher named Ernesto, who had the quality of absolute stillness that very intelligent people sometimes have, and her mother, Leonora, who assessed me over the first dinner in a way that was thorough enough that I felt it, and apparently concluded I was acceptable, because by the second day she was feeding me without asking if I was hungry, which I later understood was her primary language of approval. I fell in love with Dumaguete in that first trip, in the way you sometimes fall in love with a place that isn't yours, and can't quite be yours yet. From the outside, noticing everything, understanding almost nothing. The boulevard along the waterfront, this long, open stretch of promenade where families walked in the evenings while the sun dropped into the sea, and vendors sold everything from grilled corn to cold drinks, and nobody seemed to be in a particular hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. The way the city was small enough that Maribel ran into someone she knew every time we went anywhere, and the way those encounters were never the quick, uncomfortable nods of city people who recognize each other and want to keep moving, but actual conversations, full stops, real catching up, as if time were something the city had plenty of to spare. We went back every 3 years or so, usually for 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes a little longer when there was a family event pulling us. I learned my way around the city gradually, in the way you learn a place when you visit it regularly over decades, not deeply, not the way a resident knows it, but with a growing familiarity that added something specific to each visit, the understanding of how one street connects to another, which market had the best fresh fish on which days of the week, which specific table at the boulevard restaurant where Maribel's cousin worked gave you the best view of the water at sunset without the wind coming straight at you. When Maribel's father died in 2009, she flew back alone to be with her mother, and I kept the Chicago life running for 3 weeks the way I always did when she traveled. Competently enough, but with the particular flatness that the apartment took on whenever she was gone, a flatness that had nothing to do with the furniture or the light or anything I could point to, just the specific quality of a space that knows it's missing its main presence. When her mother's health began declining seriously around 2017, we started talking, for the first time, about what a longer-term arrangement might look like. Not moving, not yet, but extended stays. 3 months, then 4 months. Maribel in Dumaguete with her mother, me commuting back and forth as my own workload allowed, which by then was more flexible, since I'd been winding down the active side of the contracting business for a couple of years, and was operating mostly in an advisory capacity. Leonora died in 2019, a month before the world closed down, and the timing was both devastating and, in a strange way, merciful, because at least we could all be there. Marcus flying in from Seattle, me already there from the week before, all of us present for the end, in the way that the following months would have made impossible. We buried her in the family plot outside the city, and I stood at that graveside, next to Maribel, in the particular way you stand next to someone who is grieving a loss that is specifically theirs and not yours, close, supportive, present, and quietly aware of the limits of what your presence can actually do. After the burial, after the weeks of family and food, and the particular loud tenderness of Filipino mourning, which is not the quiet, contained thing American mourning tends to be, after all of that, Maribel and I sat on the small porch of her childhood home, now technically hers, and she said something that had clearly been forming for a while. She said, "I want to stay here for a little while longer, not forever, but longer than we planned." I asked her how much longer. She looked at the street, at the neighbors' houses, at the mango tree in the side yard that her father had planted before she was born, and she said, "I don't know yet. I just know I'm not ready to leave it." I flew back to Chicago for work commitments, and then the pandemic made everything complicated in the way it made everything complicated for everyone, and the border situation kept us apart for longer than either of us had planned, longer than was comfortable, longer than the phone calls and the video chats could adequately compensate for. I spent that period in Chicago in the most specific form of loneliness I'd ever encountered. Not the loneliness of a man without people. I had neighbors, I had former colleagues, I had friends who called. but the loneliness of a man whose home was simply in a different country from where he was, and who was suddenly unable to do anything practical about that. When travel opened up again, and I finally made it back to Dumaguete, I stayed for 2 months, and something happened during those 2 months that I'd been too distracted to notice on all the previous trips, which is that I stopped being a visitor. I don't mean officially or legally. I mean in the way I moved through the city, the way I understood its rhythms, the way people on our street started saying good morning to me by name, and not with the careful courtesy they'd previously extended to Maribel's American husband who passed through every few years. I met the neighbors properly, not as guests, and our immediate neighbors. They came to visit eventually, and I could tell, the moment they landed, that they were nervous about exactly what they were going to find, having spent months imagining a version of my new life that was probably far bleaker than the reality actually turned out to be. I watched them do the thing I think every skeptical loved one does when they finally see something in person instead of hearing about it second-hand over occasional phone calls. The worry on their face slowly gave way, over the course of just a few days, to something closer to relief, and eventually something closer to genuine happiness on my behalf, watching me move through an ordinary day in a life that clearly had real shape and real people in it, not the isolated, uncertain existence they'd apparently been quietly picturing all along. On the last night of that visit, sitting together somewhere quiet, they said something that stayed with me long after they'd flown home, some version of admitting they'd expected to find someone lonelier, smaller, more diminished than the person actually sitting in front of them. I told them that was more or less exactly what I'd feared finding in myself too, in those uncertain early months, and that I understood completely why they'd worried the way they had. But I also told them, and meant it fully, that worry built on imagination rarely survives contact with the actual lived truth of a situation, and that I was glad they'd finally gotten to see the truth of it for themselves, instead of continuing to worry about a version of my life that had never actually existed. To the left, a couple named Dante and Rosario became people I had actual ongoing conversations with, rather than polite exchanges through a fence. Dante was a retired barangay official, with opinions about almost everything, and the confidence of a man who was used to those opinions mattering. And Rosario made food that she distributed to the surrounding households with a generosity that seemed to require no occasion and no reciprocation, just an ongoing, unconditional decision that the people near her should eat well. Within 2 weeks of my arrival, there was food from Rosario's kitchen appearing at our gate with a regularity that I'd learned from previous visits was not something you tried to decline, since declining implied you thought her food wasn't good, which would have been incorrect and also unkind. By the end of those 2 months, I had developed what I can only describe as a routine. I walked the boulevard most mornings, not for exercise exactly, though that was the practical result, but because the boulevard in the early morning has a quality I'd been trying to articulate since my first trip in 1996, and never quite managed. Something about the light on the water and the way the city is still half asleep and unhurried, vendors just setting up, fishermen coming in from the water, the whole place doing the slow, unperformed version of itself that a city only shows before it decides it's on for the day. I'd stop at a small cafe near the Silliman University campus run by a woman named Anita, who made coffee that was too strong for my own good, and knew it, and made it that way anyway, and we'd exchange approximately 10 minutes of conversation every morning, her English and my still extremely limited Visayan cooperating imperfectly and somehow satisfactorily at the same time. I flew back to Chicago at the end of those 2 months with a decision not quite made, but taking shape in a way that I recognized from 30 years of construction work, the point in a project where the design is essentially finished in your head and the physical work is just a matter of following through on what you've already decided. I sat in my Chicago apartment that first night back and looked at the walls I'd lived inside for 24 years, and felt, for the first time, that I was looking at them as someone who was about to leave, rather than someone who had arrived. It wasn't grief for the apartment, not exactly, more like the specific tenderness you feel for a place once you've accepted that it's already, in some essential sense, behind you. I talked to Marcus first, on a Sunday call a week after getting back. He knew the conversation was coming. I think the way children who are paying attention always know these conversations are forming before their parents say them. I told him I was thinking seriously about making the move permanent, that Maribel deserved to be in the city she was from, without having to frame it as a sacrifice or a compromise, that I'd been contracting for 38 years and had the financial foundation to make this work, and that the honest truth was, if I was going to be anywhere for the next 20 years of my life, I'd rather it be somewhere I was still curious about every day, rather than somewhere I'd already long since figured out. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, I've been waiting for you to say that for about 2 years." He said it gently, with the particular relief of a son who had been watching his father try to make peace with a situation that didn't quite fit and had been unable to say so without being asked. My business partner of 17 years, a man named Dennis, who had been taking on more of the operational weight as I wound down anyway, sat with me for 3 hours over lunch in Wicker Park and walked through every practical detail of the remaining business transition with the methodical generosity of someone who had already thought through most of it before I asked. Dennis had known for at least a year that this conversation was coming. He told me because he said I'd had the look of a man saying goodbye to something for the past year, even in meetings, even in site visits, the look of someone already partly somewhere else. I told him I hadn't realized it was that visible. He laughed and said it was not remotely subtle. Getting the finances in order took about 4 months. I worked with an attorney who specialized in expat situations and an international financial planner who had handled similar transitions for other American retirees, and who walked me through the specifics without the alarm and hand-wringing I'd expected from the financial side. The numbers actually worked. Not luxuriously, not in a way that included everything I'd been accustomed to spending in Chicago, but in a way that was fundamentally sound, because the cost of living differential between Lincoln Park and Dumaguete is large enough that a retirement income that would feel modest in Chicago feels genuinely comfortable in the Philippines, not wealthy, not extravagant, but real and stable and not contingent on everything going exactly right. I researched the Special Resident Retirees Visa through the Philippine Retirement Authority, read every forum and expat resource I could find, talked to 3 different people who'd gone through the process in recent years, and who all had slightly different experiences with the paperwork and timing, but broadly agreed that the process was manageable if you were organized about it. I got a comprehensive international health insurance policy, the kind that covered emergency evacuation and major procedures, because I knew from watching others navigate this decision that healthcare was always the first concern people raised, their own and everyone else's, and I wanted a specific, documented answer ready for every version of that question before anyone thought to ask it. I sold the Lincoln Park condo in late 2021. It sold faster than I'd expected, in a market that was doing things that still confuse me to explain. And when the closing was done, I drove back to the empty apartment one last time and stood in the middle of the living room with the windows open, letting in the Chicago October air, which is perfect in October, in the way that makes you understand why people who hate Chicago winters still find it almost impossible to leave. I stood there for a long time, not thinking in any organized way, just being in that room one last time, letting the 24 years of it press back against me before I let it go. There was a shelf in the hallway where Maribel had kept a small collection of things she'd brought from Dumaguete over the years. A hand-woven piece of cloth her mother had made, a Santo Niño figurine that had moved with us from the Wicker Park apartment in 1998, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day in what looked like a church dress that might have been sewn by hand. Those things were already in Dumaguete. She'd taken them on one of the earlier trips, quietly, without announcing it as anything significant, the way she tended to do things that were actually quite significant. The shelf was empty, and it was the only part of the apartment that had already completely let go before I did. I flew out in January, a one-way ticket, which is a strange thing to hold in your hand, a ticket with a departure and no return, lighter than a round-trip ticket by exactly the weight of uncertainty you finally put down. I packed 4 boxes of tools because 38 years of contracting leaves you with a relationship to tools that is not entirely rational, but also not entirely wrong. A man needs to be able to fix what needs fixing, and a short-handled sledgehammer and a good level and a decent set of hand tools take up less room than most people's emotional baggage and are considerably more useful. The rest of what came with me fit into 2 large suitcases. Everything that didn't fit in the suitcases, or the 4 boxes, I either sold or left for Marcus to go through at his own pace, which he eventually did, keeping a handful of things I hadn't expected him to want, and releasing the rest in the way his generation seems to handle objects with more ease than mine generally manages. Landing in Manila after 16 hours of flying and then connecting to Dumaguete on a small domestic flight and stepping off that plane into air that was warm and soft and smelled of something I'd been trying to identify for 3 trips and had finally decided was simply what the air smells like in a place that's near the sea and has been growing things since long before anyone thought to name it. That arrival was different from every previous arrival, and I knew it immediately. Not because anything looked different or the airport had changed, but because I wasn't arriving for a visit. I was arriving to stay, and that changes the way a place receives you, or maybe it changes the way you receive the place. I'm still not entirely sure which direction that particular shift runs. Maribel was waiting at the terminal, which she always was, and she looked at me, and then at my suitcases, and then back at me, and said nothing for a moment, and then she smiled the way she smiled when she was more moved than she wanted to show it, which is a smile I'd been cataloging since 1991 and could still not fully describe in words. She took one of my bags from my hand and started walking, and said, over her shoulder, "Dante already knows you're here. Rosario is cooking." I told her I'd only just landed. She said she was aware of that, and that it hadn't slowed Rosario down in the slightest. The first weeks were disorienting, in the particular way that all real arrivals are disorienting. The difference between knowing a place and living in it revealing itself in dozens of small, daily ways. I could not read a tricycle route on my own for the first month, which was humbling for a man who had navigated every neighborhood in Chicago without thinking about it since he was 16 years old. I learned the local market by making wrong turns in it repeatedly and treating each wrong turn as information rather than failure, which is, in the end, how you learn any market, any city, any life you haven't lived before. I learned a few words of Visayan, the regional language, with a consistency that Maribel found endearing and the neighbors found genuinely delightful, in the way that a foreigner's honest effort with a local language that isn't one of the country's official languages delights people who usually don't expect it. Dante told me one afternoon that my Visayan pronunciation was, in his assessment, bad, in a way that was very likable, which I took as the compliment he clearly meant it as. Rosario laughed every time I tried, and then corrected me gently, and made me repeat it. And within about 3 months, I could order at a carenderia, navigate a basic conversation at the market, and follow the general shape of whatever the neighbors were discussing over the fence, which is a far sight more than I'd ever managed with any language in my life, and felt, honestly, like a kind of miracle. Around the 4-month mark, I did something that surprised even me. I reached out, through Maribel's network, to a small construction organization in the area that worked with local government on building repair and renovation projects, mostly community infrastructure, school maintenance, small public buildings, that kind of work. I'd spent 38 years looking at buildings and understanding what they needed. It turned out that skill was not location-specific. I started as essentially an informal advisor, showing up to look at things people needed looked at, offering assessments that were useful in the way that a lifetime of experience tends to be useful, quietly, without ceremony, in the specific language of what actually works versus what looks like it might work. The man who ran the organization was named Rodrigo, about 55 years old, with the bearing of someone who'd learned everything he knew by doing it rather than studying it, which meant we spoke exactly the same professional language and arrived at assessments from the same general direction. He was skeptical of me for approximately 2 weeks, and then a wall on a small covered basketball court in a barangay about 12 kilometers outside the city did something I'd been watching it prepare to do for the first 2 weeks, developed a specific kind of crack that told me the footing underneath had moved, and when I explained what was happening and why and what needed to happen to fix it correctly rather than just cosmetically, Rodrigo looked at the wall and then at me and said, "Okay, you know buildings." I told him I'd been knowing buildings for a long time. He told me that made me useful, which was about as complete an acceptance as I was going to get, and which was, honestly, more than enough. I worked with Rodrigo's organization on a volunteer basis, 3 or 4 days a week at first, often more, because the work had a quality I'd forgotten it could have, the quality of mattering, in a direct and visible way, that the more administrative final years of my Chicago business had somewhat diluted. When you walk into a school gymnasium with a leaking roof and you leave with a plan that actually addresses what's happening structurally rather than just patching the symptom, and you come back 6 weeks later and the roof is fixed and the kids are inside doing whatever kids do in gymnasiums without water dripping on them, that is a complete and satisfying thing in a way that I had almost let myself believe no longer existed for me at 68 years old. There was a particular project, a community library in a barangay called Poblacion, that had been partially constructed by volunteers years before and then stalled when funding ran out, and the original building plan turned out to have structural issues nobody had caught at the time, that I got involved in about 8 months after I arrived. It was a mess, technically, the kind of mess that makes contractors who don't know the building's history throw their hands up and recommend starting over. But I had time, and I had the habit of reading a building the way you read a book, starting from what it's already telling you before deciding what it needs to say next. And over the following 5 months, working with Rodrigo and 2 local builders named Jun and Edgardo, we took that stalled, compromised structure and turned it into something that was both structurally sound and noticeably better than the original plan. The day the library opened, the barangay captain organized a small ceremony that more people attended than I'd expected. Parents with children, teachers from the local school, municipal officials, a local journalist who took photographs and asked me 2 questions I didn't expect. First, whether I'd come from America specifically to do this work, and second, whether I planned to stay. I told her I'd come from America for other reasons entirely, and that staying was already the plan, and that the library had found me rather than the other way around. She wrote something down and looked at me with the particular expression of a journalist who's decided to use a quote, which made me slightly nervous, in the way I am always slightly nervous when I say something that sounds better in the moment than I can defend afterward. But the quote apparently survived the fact-checking of her editor, because there it was in the local paper a few days later, a photograph of me and June and Edgardo in front of the library, and a sentence I'd said about finding work that mattered in a place that hadn't asked you to stop. Marcus visited 7 months after I moved. He came alone, Chloe having been unable to get enough time off work for the trip, and he stayed for 2 weeks, long enough to actually settle into the place rather than just passing through it. I watched him in those 2 weeks, the way parents watch their adult children in a new environment, noticing everything they notice, feeling disproportionately pleased every time something lands on them the right way. He fell, immediately and predictably, for the boulevard in the evenings, spent the first 3 nights walking it until well after dark, sending me photographs of the water and the lights from positions no more than a few hundred meters from where I was standing. He met Dante and Rosario fed him with the same unconditional generosity she'd extended to me from the first week. And Marcus ate everything she put in front of him with the kind of grateful seriousness that delights Filipino women who cook, because it shows you understand what you're being given. He went with me to a session at the library on a Wednesday, sat in the back and watched, while a group of elementary school kids used the reading corner we'd built, 3 kids deep on a single bench, sharing books, arguing quietly in Visayan about something I couldn't follow, and Marcus sat there for almost an hour just watching them. On the walk back, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Dad, this is the best version of your retirement I could have imagined for you, and I couldn't have imagined this." I told him that was more or less how it had felt to me too, like something I couldn't have planned for, but could clearly see in retrospect was exactly right. He left, looking lighter than he'd arrived, which is the thing you hope for when your child travels 8,000 miles to inspect your life and make sure you're actually all right. He texted me from the Manila airport, waiting for his flight. A single sentence: "You built something good over there, old man. Call more." I called that Sunday, and every Sunday since. The healthcare question came up in real terms, about a year in, not dramatically, just the accumulated weight of 69 years old finally presenting itself in the various minor but not ignorable ways that 69 tends to. I had a knee that had been informing me of its opinions since a construction site fall in 2007, and it began expressing those opinions with renewed emphasis, and I ended up at a private hospital in Dumaguete for an orthopedic consultation that was so thorough and so reasonably priced that I sat in the billing office afterward, genuinely rechecking the numbers because I couldn't initially account for the difference between what I'd expected to pay and what was on the invoice. The orthopedist, a woman named Dr. Villanueva, who had trained in Manila and done a fellowship in Australia, was so competent and so direct about her assessment and so unfussed about the specific concerns I raised that I actually enjoyed the appointment, which is not something I have previously been able to say about any medical appointment in my adult life. My international health insurance covered the costs that applied, and what wasn't covered was a bill that would have been a copay in Chicago. I told this story to my former doctor in Chicago the next time we connected over a video call for what had become an informal annual check-in, and he was quiet in the way that American doctors are sometimes quiet when confronted with international healthcare cost comparisons. A silence that contains several things at once, most of them not particularly comfortable. There was a month, about 14 months in, that I want to be honest about, because this story is not a story about how everything went perfectly, or how moving to a new country later in life is a series of beautiful mornings and meaningful work and food appearing at your door from generous neighbors. There was a month where I was sick for 2 weeks, with a combination of a respiratory infection and the kind of exhaustion that follows 2 weeks of being physically unwell at 69 years old. And Maribel was away visiting a cousin in Cebu for part of that time, and I spent several days in our house feeling the specific flatness of being unwell and alone in a country that still had pockets of unfamiliarity I could fall into when I didn't have the energy to navigate around them. I missed Chicago in that stretch, in the specific, unglamorous way you miss a place where everything is already solved for you, where the pharmacy is where you know it is, and the pharmacist knows your name, and the particular brand of everything you need is on a shelf you've located by memory 100 times before. That's not a small thing when you're sick and tired and operating in a country that does things slightly differently from the way you've done them for 69 years. And I want to say it plainly rather than leave it out, because leaving it out would be dishonest and would also do a disservice to anyone who's genuinely thinking about a move like this and needs to know what the actual range of experience looks like. What got me through that month was the same thing that had been assembling itself around me since I arrived, quietly and without my direct management. Dante knocked on the gate 3 days into my being sick and stood there with a look that said he already knew what was happening and had decided to deal with it, and spent an afternoon fixing a drain pipe outside the kitchen that had been bothering me for 2 weeks and that I hadn't had the energy to address. Rosario sent food without pausing. Anita from the cafe sent coffee with the tricycle driver, who made deliveries in the morning, strong and correct, and accompanied by a handwritten note that said simply, in her mix of English and Cebuano, "Get better fast. It's boring without you." I called Maribel in Cebu, and she came back 2 days earlier than planned. No discussion, no drama, just arrived at the door with the combination of efficiency and love that she has always applied to problems that need solving. By the time I was on the other side of it, I had a clearer picture of what I was actually inside here, not just a pleasant arrangement in a beautiful place, but an actual community, the kind that doesn't announce itself or arrive with fanfare, but shows up in a driveway at 3 in the afternoon with a plumber's wrench and a container of food and a note about being missed. That's not something you build quickly in a city of 3 million people. It's something that seems to assemble itself in smaller cities, in places where the scale is still human enough that being known is a natural consequence of simply being present consistently. 3 years in now, let me tell you what the actual shape of my days looks like. Not the highlight version, not the list of meaningful moments that would fit nicely in a travel article, but the actual ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday or a Thursday in Dumaguete. I wake up earlier than I used to, somewhere around 5:30, because the city starts earlier than Chicago ever did, and because the air in the early morning has that quality I mentioned, the one I've been failing to properly articulate for 25 years, and I've learned to stop trying to articulate it and just be in it instead. I make coffee in the kitchen, and Maribel is usually already awake before me, moving through the house in the way she has always moved through whatever house we've lived in, with a directness and a purposefulness that makes the house feel organized even before anything has actually been organized. We eat something small in the morning, sometimes leftovers from whatever Rosario sent the evening before, sometimes eggs and rice in the way that Maribel makes them, which is not the way I was raised to think about eggs and rice, but which has long since become the way I think about eggs and rice. I walk the boulevard most mornings. The walk takes 40 minutes if I'm moving, longer if Anita is talkative, which she usually is. I stop at the cafe. I have the coffee that is too strong and the small sweet bread that Anita makes on Tuesdays and Fridays, and which she will tell you she makes for everyone, and which she serves to a small, reliable circle of regulars with the specific favoritism of someone who does not entirely believe in impartiality. On Mondays and Thursdays, I go to meet Rodrigo and his team, and there is usually a site to visit, a building to assess, a problem to talk through in the particular language of structural reality versus structural wishful thinking. On Wednesdays, I spend most of the afternoon at the library, sometimes just being there, sometimes helping with whatever the librarian, a young woman named Glacelle who runs the place with the organizational precision of someone 2 decades older, has decided needs improving. I call Marcus on Sundays. He and Chloe have announced that they are expecting a child in the spring, which means I will be, in the spring, a grandfather, and this has done something to my sense of time and place and permanence that I'm still working out. Maribel has been incandescent about it in the way that Filipino women are incandescent about the arrival of grandchildren, visibly, audibly, in a way that the neighbors already know about, even though Marcus and Chloe announced it 3 weeks ago. Rosario cried when Maribel told her, which made Maribel cry, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching 2 women I love very much cry together about something wonderful, which is a category of experience I do not have an equivalent precedent for in Chicago. There are hard things about this life that I want to account for honestly, because honesty is what makes this kind of account worth anything. The internet is not always reliable, which is a thing I have had to make a kind of peace with that I have not entirely successfully made. There are days when video calls with Marcus drop and reconnect and drop again, and when that happens during a conversation that matters, the technical frustration has an edge to it that wouldn't be there if we were only a flight away, instead of a connection away. I have had days where I miss the city in ways that are not about anything specific, just the accumulated weight of 68 years of Chicago in my body, the way a city gets into you physically, the rhythm of its streets and its seasons and its particular audacity, and on those days there is no fix except to walk the boulevard and let Dumaguete do what it has consistently, patiently done, which is be itself in a way that eventually stops feeling foreign and starts feeling familiar. I miss Dennis, my former business partner. In the ordinary way, you miss a person you spent 17 years working alongside and with whom you never ran out of things to argue about productively. We talk by video every few weeks, and he visited once, the previous year, a man who had never been to Southeast Asia, and approached the whole experience with a blend of skepticism and concealed curiosity that I recognized as the same blend with which he had always approached anything he hadn't personally assessed yet. By day 4, he had opinions about the best querenderia on the boulevard, which is a thing that happens faster than anyone ever anticipates. I want to say something about Maribel that I've been circling around since I started telling this story, because she is the essential fact of all of it, and I don't want to tell this story in a way that places her in the background of her own homecoming. We have been married 32 years. We have been, in any meaningful measure, each other's primary home for 32 years. which means for 32 years there has been a dual quality to every place either of us has lived. It has been ours together before it has been either of ours alone. When I came to Chicago, I came to a city that had been hers for 7 years before it was mine, and she made it mine so thoroughly that the adoption happened without my exactly noticing it. When I came to Dumaguete to stay, I came to a city that was hers in the deepest possible way, the way a place you were born in and left and came back to and lost your parents in is yours in a way no city you chose as an adult can quite be. And she has been making it mine, with the same thoroughness and the same patience she applied to Chicago 30 years ago, which is to say, by being herself here so completely that being near her in this place makes the place feel like somewhere I belong. She told me once, after I'd been here about 18 months, that watching me become someone the neighbors knew and called by name and ran into on the boulevard and argued with productively about minor things the way you argue with someone who lives near you and isn't going anywhere. That watching me become that had been the thing she hadn't been able to fully let herself want until it was actually happening, because wanting it before it was certain would have required imagining a version of our life that she hadn't been sure she was allowed to ask me to choose. I told her she could have asked me 30 years ago. She told me 30 years ago I would have said yes, and spent the next 20 years being quietly conflicted about it. I told her that was annoyingly accurate. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before I stood in that Chicago kitchen with cold coffee and a sideways wind and an apartment that had temporarily stopped feeling like a place I needed to be. I know that a life built over decades in one city is real and worth everything, and also that it isn't the only life available to you at 68, which is a thing American culture is not particularly good at telling you. I know that the skills you spend a working life building don't become irrelevant when you cross an. Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know these stories ask more of your time than most of what's out there, but I hope it was worth it, and I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the length of this video does. If you want more stories like this one told the same honest way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from, and I think if this one landed, you'll want to hear where the rest of them go too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.